Sans-serif fonts are everywhere. I mean, everywhere you go. A lot of viewers will be familiar with the most famous sans-serif, Helvetica. It's been said by some that it's the perfect typeface, the pinnacle of modern design. It's so famous and its cult following so evangelical that it got a whole feature-length documentary dedicated to it 10 years ago. But sans-serifs weren't always so popular. In fact, up until the 20th century, they were not only ridiculed and reserved for quote-unquote uncultured writing, they were barely existent. Most presses simply wouldn't print anything but serif fonts.
By means of printing, the fund of knowledge accumulated through the ages is available to everyone, rich and poor alike.
In 1928, a German graphic designer named John Chichold published a book called The New Typography. It would later become a sort of Bible amongst typographers of the modern age, but when it was first published, very few people outside of Chicold's inner circle read it. Due to tough economic conditions in post-war Germany, the book didn't make it past its first print run. And this should really come at no surprise. Very few people at the time even knew what the word typography meant, and those who did, Chicold's peers in the field, would have been offended by almost everything he wrote in the book. In it, he trashed traditional typographers as being behind the times compared to his peers in what was about to become one of the most important design movements of the 20th century. In the book, he explained this new movement. This is the fundamental mark of the modern movement and the new typography. No less than the new technology, the new architecture, and the new music, it is not a mere fashion, but an expression of a newly opening epoch of European culture. You can see why he turned off a few people. He went on to describe the problem that modern typography solved. Modern man has to absorb every day a mass of printed matter. The form of printing also must adapt itself to the conditions of modern life. What Chicold was describing was a broader shift taking place all across the Western world. The birth of an educated middle class and printing press innovations led to an explosion in the amount of information. Meanwhile, the invention of the railroad meant that corporations, a modern concept themselves, could suddenly sell goods to people hundreds of miles away. That meant selling to people with whom they had no existing relationship, which required advertising. There were suddenly books, magazines, pamphlets, billboards, ads, and dozens of new forms of information engulfing people in this new world. The industrial era was in full swing, and Chicold, along with his peers, intended on creating typefaces that made the entire revolution less overwhelming. And they made good progress until a populist demagogue with an affection for traditional German type sent Europe into war. In 1933, Adolf Hitler seized power in Germany and began to threaten everything the new typographers were working towards. Shortly after his election, Hitler announced that all graphic designers had to register with the Ministry of Culture. Days later, policemen stormed Chicold's home and found numerous posters from his Russian counterparts, whom he had a tremendous amount of respect for, not because they were communists, but because they shared his love of modern type. Both he and his wife were arrested and then miraculously managed to escape 6 weeks later to Switzerland, thanks to the help of a sympathetic policeman. In Switzerland, Chicold found refuge in a new group of peers and reconnected with fellow émigré Paul Renner, who years before had created Futura, which is about to become one of the most popular fonts of the century. But with German forces advancing and threatening all of Europe, Chicold and many of his peers sought asylum in the UK and the United States. And this is really when modern typography goes from being loved by a few designers in Germany, parts of Russia, and the Netherlands, to being the font of choice for corporations, governments, and just about everyone. Chicold goes on in the post-war years to work for Penguin, one of the world's largest publishing houses, and with him he brings his design philosophy. Many of his peers go on to work at type foundries and ad agencies in the United States that create work like the famous VW Think Small ad. And a new age of design is born. To give you a sense of how big this change was, consider that in 1895, serifs were used in just over 5% of newspaper headlines. By 1955, that number grew 10x to 54%. Very few people are aware of the prevalence of sans-serif fonts. Still fewer realize what a new development its popularity really is, historically speaking. Sans-serif fonts have become the de facto choice at this point. Helvetica was the default font when the Mac launched, and then Microsoft copied it, later changing to Arial, another sans-serif. This Evernote document I'm working in, it's a sans-serif. The book in front of me, sans-serif. And all of that is really thanks to the work of a small group of graphic designers who survived communist and Nazi purges in Europe and Russia and went on to spread their ideas around the world.